Hey everybody, today is going to be our third day of notes for the prehistory unit. Today we're going to cover the Neolithic Revolution, and we'll find out why that's so important for humanity. And we'll also talk about the beginnings of civilization, and we'll find out what a civilization is. Last class we talked about this structure, which was found in England. So in the comments, go ahead and see if you can remember the name of it and post it. Give you guys about 10 seconds. So it is Stonehenge. Hopefully you got that right. It's a mysterious Neolithic monument. We think it's a place of worship or burial ground, and it's located in southern England. So that's one of those pictures that pop up on the SOL. And since we've seen it on 2 days of notes, it'll definitely pop up on your test. So make sure you know what Stonehenge looks like. Last class, we covered the Paleolithic Age, or the Old Stone Age. We talked about what life was like for humans during that time. The Paleolithic Age was a time where humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They were nomads following herds of animals for food. They developed simple stone tools. They learned how to communicate through talking. They created cave art, learned how to bury their dead, and were able to create fire. The Neolithic Revolution, or the New Stone Age, is probably the greatest change in all of human history. The Neolithic Revolution gives us the invention of farming by humans. Our technical term for farming is agriculture, and the development of agriculture leads to huge changes in society, huge changes in how humans live their lives. We get the development of agrarian societies. Those are societies that practice farming. And up until the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s, most societies in the world are going to be agrarian. That means that most of the people work to produce food. So at this time, humans learn how to domesticate wild plants as well as animals, and they're able to breed different plants, different animals together for human use. Think about corn. When we think of corn in the grocery store, we think of cobs, ears of corn that are about 12 inches long, with big whitish yellowish kernels, and it's usually sweet. But that's not how corn originally was. An ear of corn would have been much shorter before domestication, maybe 4 inches, might be different colors like that bluish purple. The kernels would be smaller and it would not be as sweet. But over time, we've learned how to make corn that is much bigger, sweeter. You get more bang for your buck. And of course, we do the same for animals. We put animals together and have them breed to produce animals that are easier for us to control. So we tame them over time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes hundreds and hundreds of years to do this sometimes. And if you have any idea of the first animal that was domesticated, go ahead and post that in the comments if you think you know the animal that humans first domesticated. So the first animal that was domesticated was actually the dog. Man's best friend started out as wolves, kind of wildish dogs, but the ones who stuck around humans to eat the carcasses of animals that we left behind would eventually become more and more tame. And as they had children, little puppies, those puppies grew up to be more tame as well. So dogs were the first domesticated animal by humans. Of course, the greatest animal domesticated by humans is definitely the cat. Right now, my cat looks pretty lazy sleeping next to me, but cats you can put in your barn and they'll help get rid of mice for you. And since dogs got their early start on domestication, cats are a little bit more on the wild side. Mine definitely don't listen as well. So the earliest domestication of plants and animals occurs in the Fertile Crescent, an area that we're going to talk about in the Middle East. So here we have a map showing the Fertile Crescent. It's this green area. And why do we think this area is fertile? Fertile meaning the soil is rich. It's good for growing your crops. Why do we think this area is such a good place to grow your crops? And it's because it's located so close to water sources. Here we see in this area, we've got rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Okay. Here we're by the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and over here we've got the Nile River. So this shape kind of looks like a crescent moon, like a sliver of the moon, kind of on its side. And because the soil is so rich in this area, this is where the first farming is going to take place. And if you were to look on a modern day map for this area, this would be Saudi Arabia, you would have Iraq over here, and further to the east you would have Iran. Those are the modern day countries that you would find in this region. We will need to know the two rivers that are in this area, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the way I remember which one is the Tigris and which one is the Euphrates is their location. The Tigris is on top. If a tiger were to pounce on you, it lands on top. So the Tigris River is like a tiger. It's always going to be on top of the Euphrates River. So Tigris to the north, Tigris on top. The biggest effect of agriculture is that people no longer had to live as nomads. They could now establish permanent homes, which would eventually become villages. Okay, they would become farming communities. The oldest known villages are Katohayak, which is in modern-day Turkey, Jericho, located in Israel, and Aleppo, which is in Syria. We'll talk about these villages in just a little bit. Some people did not give up the nomadic life. They chose to remain hunter-gatherers. They chose to move from season to season. And even today in Mongolia, for instance, there are tribes who live as nomadic pastoralists. That means they take their animals from grassland to grassland, searching for fresh grass for their herd to eat. Humans develop irrigation systems, meaning they're going to dig ditches from those rivers to bring water to their crops. You've probably done something similar at the beach where you've dug a little trench and the beach water, as it hits the sand, some of it splashes in and stays into the ditch that you created. They also developed slash and burn farming. So they would cut down all the vegetation in an area and burn it, and that leads to more nutrients getting into the soil. And the more nutrients that the soil has, it's going to have a higher crop output. You're going to be able to produce more food on that ground. The biggest problem is that you can only do this so many times before you have to move on. You've burned out all the vegetation, and it's not going to come back for a long time. So you will use up a lot of your land very quickly. But what you end up with is a surplus of food. A surplus means more than enough to survive. And because of that, we have even more changes which take place in the Neolithic Revolution. So here we have depictions of Katohayak, which is in Turkey. And take a minute and write down some descriptions of what this village looks like to you. What do the structures look like? What do they have? What are they missing? Go ahead and write those out in the comments. So they remind me of townhouses because they're close together and a lot of times they share a wall. It doesn't look like they had been planned. They just built where they could. But what you can really notice is that they haven't figured out how to create doorways or windows. They're not at the point where they can stabilize a structure so that the wall won't cave in on itself when it has a door or windows. So instead, what they would do is they would build a trap door on the roof. You would take your ladder up to the roof, and then you would go in through this trap door. Here we can see they've now developed windows and doors, but they put them on a second story of the structure. So you can see over time they develop new techniques. We have a few different names for modern day Turkey, this country here. Okay, we call it Turkey. We call it Anatolia, or the Anatolian Peninsula, and we also call it Asia Minor. Okay, so we use all those names. You need to know all three, and that is where Çatalhöyük would have been located. It's a city in Turkey. Here we have the village of Jericho, which is located in Israel. And you'll notice a few things about Jericho. What do we see? Hopefully the first thing you notice is that this village has walls going around it. And we're going to need walls because now that we farm, we have that surplus of food. We've got extra food. Well, let's say a few miles away, there's a tribe who live as nomads. And they know that you have food, and they can't find any sources of food, not enough animals for them to survive on. They might decide to attack you. It might be better for them to attack. Maybe they die, but maybe they kill you and take your food instead. So now we need to be able to defend ourselves from other humans. You'll also see that we have a source of water. In this case, it's an oasis. So having a surplus of food is very important because whenever we have more food, we usually have more people. Okay, more people are going to survive and not die of starvation. People are more willing to have children because they know that they can feed these children. We have a healthier society. This surplus of food means that not everyone needs to produce food. Not everyone needs to be a farmer. If we were to go around in class and ask whose parents were farmers, there would not be very many who were. What we get instead is specialization of labor. People who are not farmers now learn how to do new jobs, which involves skill and knowledge. And that's not saying farmers don't have skill or knowledge. They have a particular skill as well. But these specialists, like potters, smiths, people who make weapons and tools, and weavers who make baskets, they're going to develop skills which they pass on through their family, father to son, and they're going to try to keep other people out of that profession because it makes them more valuable to society. So you don't wake up one day and just know how to create a sword. You need to be taught that skill. And these specialists are called artisans, not artists, but artisans. Those are people who perform skilled labor. So specialization of labor helps us to develop an economy, and that is an exchange of goods and services. We don't have a money system yet, so instead we use the barter system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's the idea that you trade one item for another item without the use of money. And this will lead to social classes, a hierarchy in society that's usually represented by a pyramid with the most powerful at the top and the least powerful at the bottom. We will look at an example of a social structure, a social hierarchy, in just a little bit. But more food means more free time for people. They're not worried about farming, and those people who aren't farming can come up with new inventions and innovations to try to improve society. So we get improvements all across the Fertile Crescent. We see the development of bricks made from clay to build stronger houses. We get the wheel, which we can use for easier movement. We can transport goods. We can create plows. And of course, the plow means easier farming. Now we can cut into the earth, and it's going to make farming quicker and more efficient. We will develop pottery to store food and other items. We did not need pottery before we learned how to farm because you couldn't really carry anything with you. You were moving following the animal herds, so you had to carry a light load. We developed cloth from different fibers to make better clothing. We're not just wearing animal skins anymore. These people developed calendars to track the growing seasons. We need to know when we're going to have a rainy season. We need to know when the rivers are going to flood so that we can plan to plant our crops. We begin using metal tools instead of just stone tools. We use copper and eventually bronze. And these are going to be stronger, sharper, and lighter than stone. They're going to make work easier. Does anyone know what we need to make bronze? In order to make bronze, we need copper and tin. Villages are going to grow, and society is going to become more complex. Villages will develop their own unique cultures. We talked about that on our first day of notes. A culture is society's unique way of life. It incorporates things like dance, religion, language, music, food. So each of these villages will have their own culture, different from other villages around them. From there, trade will develop as well. These villages are going to trade with one another. A village near a pond might be able to fish. Another village might be very good at raising cows. So they might decide to trade so many fish for a cow. But they don't just trade items. Instead, we get cultural diffusion, an exchange of goods and ideas between cultures. Cultural diffusion, those are our two favorite words in World History 1. So that village who was able to fish, maybe they teach the village that raises cows how to fish, how to make a fishing rod, and how to use different sorts of bait in order to catch fish. That's an example of cultural diffusion. We still have cultural diffusion today, but it happens very rapidly. If anyone remembers, probably back in 2014, there was that hit song, "What Does the Fox Say?" I know because I heard it all the time when students poked their heads into my classroom and asked me that. That song was not from the United States. It was actually from Sweden, and it didn't take very long for it to come to the United States, and everybody had heard it. Fortunately, it died out just about as quick. From there, villages will grow into cities. We'll talk about the difference between villages and cities. And cities will develop into distinct civilizations. And the 4 civilizations will be our next unit coming up after this one. So the picture on the left shows us what life was like around 8000 BCE when we first started the Neolithic Revolution. We first learned how to farm. Okay, it doesn't look very complex compared to the picture on the right, which is of a city. This would be a city located in the civilization of Sumer. And we can see it's very complex. We have these large walls, giant structures. The structure in the middle was called a ziggurat. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And it takes lots and lots of people, lots and lots of planning to develop something as advanced as the city on the right compared to the farming village we see on the left. So we have 5 characteristics of a civilization, 5 things a civilization needs to be a civilization. The first is advanced cities. And the difference between a village and a city is that a city is a center of trade for a larger area. People from smaller villages will take their goods from their homes and take it to the city in order to trade, knowing that lots of people are going to come and they're going to be doing the same thing as well. The second characteristic of a civilization would be specialized workers. So those that don't have to farm are freed up to become artisans and work in a craft. So on the left we have a priest. They will be high on the social hierarchy system. In the middle, we've got a scribe. What do we think a scribe does? What is their job? They're holding a piece of wet clay. And this tool that he's holding in his other hand is a stylus. Okay, if you've played Nintendo 3DS before, you use that to touch the screen when you're playing some games. So a scribe is a professional writer. They don't have pens or pencils, so he uses that stylus to punch in his characters, which are kind of like letters, but not quite, into the wet clay. The wet clay will dry. And then finally on the right, we have a potter. They make pots, and you can store things in pots. So here we're looking at the social class system of Egypt, and it's a hierarchy, meaning the people with the most power are at the top, the people with the least amount of power at the bottom. So at the top we have the pharaoh or king. There's only one of him, so his little triangle is going to be the smallest compared to those under him, where we have more people. So below the pharaoh are the priests and the nobles. The priests help to advise the pharaoh. The nobles are landowners. They have their power because they own land. And the more land you own, the more food you can grow on your land, thus giving you more power. In the middle, we have traders, artisans, shopkeepers, and scribes, people who have specialized jobs which take skill. Below them are farmers and herders. They provide food to society. And at the bottom, you have unskilled laborers. They're not farmers. Many times they're servants and slaves. They would be at the bottom. Our third characteristic of a civilization is going to be complex institutions. An institution is a long-lasting pattern of organization in a community. So some examples during this time period would be government, a system of ruling. Okay, a civilization would probably have some way of ruling. In this case, each of our city-states would have their own king to rule the city. They would have a religion. So they'd have a similar belief system and moral values. At this time, it was polytheism, meaning they had many gods, and these gods would be shared across the civilization. And an economy. And we said that they would use the barter economy, where you exchange one good for another. We also have complex institutions in our modern day world. We also have a system of government in the United States. In November, citizens will be allowed to vote as the presidential election is coming up. But also think about this. Around the time you turn 5, what happens to you as a child? You go to kindergarten. So that's also an institution. It's been around so long that we do that it kind of just happens on its own at this point almost. The next thing a civilization needs is record keeping. So in Sumer, our first civilization, we have scribes who are professional record keepers. So they're writers. And the system of writing that they use in Sumer is called cuneiform. Make sure you know that cuneiform was the system of writing used in Sumer. It was the first system of writing ever invented. And it uses wedge shapes that was pushed into clay by a stylus, and then over time the clay would dry and you would have a tablet. So at this point we're moving from the prehistoric era into a time of history. We now have writing. The last thing that a civilization needs is advanced technology. And when we look at these examples, we wouldn't think that they're very advanced compared to our own cars, computers, planes, TVs. But for their time, they were very advanced. They would use animals like an ox to hook up to a plow to turn the soil, irrigation systems so that they could plant their crops further away from rivers. They would have potter's wheels to help shape bowls and plates. And even today, you can go to some artsy craft places and they'll let you make your own pots using the wheel, the potter's wheel, that is. And finally, the wheel and the sail will help traders to move goods. And then at the bottom, we've got another example of advanced technology. In this case, it is called the shadoof, which is just a lot of fun to say, shadoof. So it's kind of like a crane, and you would have something heavy like rocks tied to one end, attached to one end, and a bucket on the other, and it would help you to lift water out of a river. This water would be very heavy in the bucket, so this simple machine helps you to pull it out of the river with less effort. So our first civilization is called Sumer. Sumer is this area between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And all the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is called Mesopotamia. So we tend to use those two names interchangeably, Sumer and Mesopotamia. And we can do that in this class. For us, it means the same thing, but on a technical level, Sumer is the name of the civilization, Mesopotamia is the land. So our first civilization is created in modern-day Iraq. This civilization was composed of city-states. Each city-state would have their own patron god or goddess, one god or goddess they worshipped above all others, and they would each be ruled by their own king. So they were not a united kingdom. It would kind of be like if Fairfax, Alexandria, Arlington, were all ruled by their own leader, and they might interact by trading with each other, but they each have their own government. So is one of the earliest cities, along with Uruk, Lagesh, and Kish. So to make sense of it all, is the smallest unit. It's a city-state. Sumer is the civilization, and Mesopotamia is the largest unit. It's the entire piece of land between the two rivers. And the city of the U and R, are actually in Sumer itself right here. So that's how I remember that is actually in the civilization of Sumer. So what was life like in Around 3000 BCE, as we are going out of the Stone Age, around 30,000 people lived in this city-state. Had strict social classes. If you were a farmer, your children would be farmers. Their children would be farmers. The same would be said of priests. If you're a priest, your son would probably become a priest as well. The ruler, a king, and his priest held the most power in the city-state. Merchants, artisans, and artists profited, though. They were becoming wealthy, even though they didn't have as much power as the nobles, the priest, and the king. They had a moon goddess, it says god, but it should be goddess, named Nana, who was their patron goddess, the one they worshipped above all others. People lived in the box-like structures that were built very close together. And at the center of the city was the ziggurat. Make sure you underline that. This was the temple and center of worship, also a place of storage for extra grain, as well as a center for business. So here we have our ziggurat at It kind of reminds me of a layered cake, like a wedding cake. And they can't build a structure straight up and down because they don't have the technology to keep it from collapsing. So instead, they build smaller layers on top of bigger layers. So it doesn't quite look like the pyramids we're used to seeing in Egypt, but more like something you would see that the Aztec in Mexico would have built. And the reason that they look like this isn't because of ancient aliens, but because this is the only way to build large structures with the technology that they had. And as we wrap up, we need to know the difference between the Paleolithic age and the Neolithic age. What are the characteristics of each? So now that we've gone through this prehistory unit, you should be able to look at these two pictures and have a good idea of which one could be Paleolithic and which one could be Neolithic.